Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, today we are diving into something surprisingly intense, the political battles behind India's economic foundations. We're going to be explaining the chapter on the politics of planned development. So we'll unpack how an entire nation, literally fresh out of colonial rule, had to sit down and chart its economic future. It's a story absolutely full of high-stakes debates, massive ideological shifts, and profound choices that honestly still echo today. Let's get into it. Now, to really grasp the complexities of this history, let's actually start with a modern conflict. It forces us to ask a really tough question. Whose need is Orissa's need? Think about it. As the global demand for steel surged, Orissa, which happens to sit on massive untapped iron ore reserves, became this prime investment destination. So, a memorandum of understanding gets signed with a Korean company to build a mega steel plant. But this immediately forces us to ask, what does development actually mean? And more importantly, who does it really serve? This situation brilliantly illustrates how development isn't just, about economic data or GDP growth. No, it's a massive political clash. On one hand, the state government wants the huge capital investment and all the jobs that the plant would bring. Makes sense, right? But wait, the iron ore lies in underdeveloped, predominantly tribal districts, so the tribal population is terrified of displacement and losing their livelihood. Then you've got environmentalists who fear severe mining pollution, and meanwhile, the central government is looking at the macro picture, afraid that blocking the industry would discourage other national investments. Decisions like this, they can't just be made on a spreadsheet. They require weighing the very real interests of one group against another. So let's see how India's founding leaders tried to solve this exact dilemma of prioritizing needs by stepping back in time. Here's our roadmap for today's explainer. We'll look at the meaning of development, forging a national consensus, the Planning Commission, the first plan, the second plan, and finally, the enduring contradictions. All right, starting with part one, the meaning of development. Right after independence, the term development was pretty much universally associated with Western modernization. It generally meant breaking down traditional social structures and embracing capitalism and scientific rationality. But Indian leaders quickly realized they needed a unique approach. Progress in a largely agrarian, deeply diverse nation couldn't just mean copy-pasting the West. So the debate over how to achieve this quickly settled into two distinct ideological camps. On the left, you had folks who favored state control of the economy, prioritizing regulation and redistribution over free competition. On the right, you had those who championed the free market, believing that free competition alone ensures progress and the government just shouldn't intervene unnecessarily. Keep in mind, this was during the Cold War, so these mapped roughly onto the Soviet socialist model versus the American capitalist model. The crucial question was, which path would India actually choose? That brings us to part two, forging a national consensus. Now, despite those really sharp ideological differences we just talked about, a broad consensus actually emerged. Across the board, people agreed that the government simply had to actively design the economy. Looking at this timeline, it condenses decades of institutional history. Notice that first date, 1944. This is wild. Before independence was even officially achieved, a group of leading private industrialists got together and drafted the Bombay Plan. Normally, you'd assume private businesses want a completely open, unregulated market, right? But here, they were actually proposing a planned economy where the state would take major initiatives in industrial investment. This early consensus completely paved the way for the institutional milestones that followed, eventually culminating way later in 2015 when the Niti Aayog replaced the original commission. Moving on to part three, the Planning Commission. Okay, so to execute this massive, unprecedented national vision, a central machinery had to be established. Enter the Planning Commission, set up in March 1950. Interestingly, it was created by a simple government resolution. It wasn't even explicitly drafted in the Constitution itself. But this advisory body became the single most influential engine for the nation's economic future. The Prime Minister served as its chairperson, and its mandate was directly inspired by the directive principles of state policy. Basically, they aimed to ensure that citizens had adequate livelihood and that the economic system didn't result in some harmful concentration of wealth. Which leads perfectly into part four, the first plan, and its philosophy to hasten slowly. Launched in 1951, the first five-year plan really sought to break the country's massive cycle of poverty. A young economist named K.N. Raj, who helped draft it, famously argued that India should, quote, hasten slowly. The fear here was that forcing an economic transformation too fast could actually destabilize the newly formed democracy. So they focused on patience. They aimed to push national savings up, which, by the way, was incredibly hard given how little people had back then. And they aggressively targeted land reforms, seeing them as the principal obstacle to agricultural growth. And this image beautifully illustrates the era's focus. The first plan was all about the agrarian sector. The partition had hit agriculture extremely hard, so it needed urgent attention. Massive, and I mean massive, investments were poured into irrigation and energy projects. Just look at this beautiful historical postage stamp featuring the Bakra Nangal Dam. To the leaders of the time, these dams weren't just infrastructure. They were basically the towering temples of a new, modern, but still agriculturally rooted India. Let's turn to part 5, the second plan and its pivot to rapid industrialization. So by 1956, the mood had shifted dramatically. The patience of the first plan? Gone. They leaned heavily into industry. Under the leadership of a brilliant statistician named P.C. Mahalanobis, the goal became quick structural transformation in literally all possible directions. This shift was further cemented by a famous resolution passed by the ruling Congress Party at Avadi, which declared a socialist pattern of society as its explicit goal. To pull this off, the government started imposing substantial tariffs on imports, essentially to forcefully protect and nurture domestic industries. You can really see that definitive turning point represented here. This stamp, featuring Chittaranjan locomotives, perfectly symbolizes the new era. The second plan meant massive public sector growth. We are talking about huge investments in steel, railways, electricity, and heavy machinery. Thanks to a protected economic environment and growing national savings, industrialization truly took off. It was an absolute game changer for the nation's developmental path. Finally, part 6, the enduring contradictions. Now, as you can imagine, constructing a nation's economy from the ground up isn't exactly a flawless science. The aggressive push for industry created an immediate set of structural challenges. Because India was technologically backward at the time, it had to spend its highly precious foreign exchange just to buy technology from the global market. Plus, balancing industry and agriculture proved to be highly difficult. Since industry was suddenly absorbing so much investment, the very real possibility of severe food shortages began looming large. Critics at the time loudly pointed out that these planning strategies displayed an unmistakable urban bias. Basically, rural agricultural communities felt completely abandoned in favor of these large, heavy factories. Scholar Francine Frankel actually captures this historical tension perfectly. She points out how there were two contradictory tendencies constantly at play. On one hand, you had the ruling party explicitly endorsing socialist principles of state ownership to curb economic concentration. But simultaneously, and here's the catch, the government was pursuing liberal economic policies and offering incentives to private investments simply because they absolutely needed to achieve maximum production. It was a constant, delicate, and often contradictory tightrope walk between pure ideology and harsh pragmatism. Which brings us full circle, right back to the beginning. Remember the tribal populations, the state government, and the environmentalists arguing over that massive steel plant in Orissa? Well, as we conclude this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves, are these exact same historical contradictions still driving our conflicts today? When we debate whose needs matter most, the push for industrial capital versus the preservation of local livelihoods and the environment, we are actively participating in the very same political contestation that started way back in the 1950s. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Have we actually resolved the politics of planned development, or have the players just changed their names? Thank you so much for joining me to explore this fascinating chapter. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you in the next explainer.